Kalen always believed that one day he might die protecting Sienna, but he never imagined the person who would send him to his death would be her. Deep within the kingdom's deadliest S-rank dungeon, Sienna's blade pierced straight through his back. The swordswoman worshipped by the entire kingdom simply watched as he fell into a pit of poison. Taking the treasure with her, she turned away and left him to die. But days later, while Sienna was holding a grand funeral for the man she had betrayed, a lone figure appeared. Among the mourners, a man who should have been dead, and, with a single touch, he reclaimed everything he had ever given her: her blood, her vitality, her power, and the legend she had built upon his sacrifice. Long before he became one of the kingdom's greatest healers, long before he was betrayed in an S-rank dungeon, Kalen was just a boy with nothing. He had no family, no possessions, and no one to protect him. Kalen grew up in the slums on the western edge of Valeris. It was a place where abandoned children learned how to survive long before they learned how to read. Every day was a battle for food, a battle for a place to sleep, and sometimes a battle just to survive the night. Kalen was only 9 years old, thin, frail, and smaller than most children his age. That made him an easy target for older kids. They stole the little food he managed to find. They shoved him into the mud and laughed whenever he tried to fight back. One freezing winter afternoon, things became worse than usual. Kalen had finally earned a loaf of stale bread after working all day. It was the first food he'd had in nearly 2 days. Before he could eat it, a group of older boys blocked his path. They snatched the bread away and tossed it between themselves like a game. Kalen tried to take it back. All he got in return were punches and mocking laughter. Eventually, they knocked him to the frozen ground. Blood trickled from his lip. His entire body ached. But the worst pain was the helplessness. Then a voice called out from behind them. "Stop." The boys turned around. A young girl stood at the entrance of the alley. She wore simple training clothes. Her dark hair was tied neatly behind her. A wooden practice sword rested in her hand. It was the first time Kalen met Sienna Ravenheart. She was only 10 years old, yet her gaze was sharp enough to make older boys hesitate. One of them laughed. "Get lost unless you want the same treatment." Sienna didn't answer. She simply walked forward. A minute later, the entire group was running away. No one was seriously hurt, but none of them wanted to challenge that strange girl any longer. Once the alley fell silent, Sienna picked up the loaf of bread. She brushed off the dirt and handed it back to him. "Are you okay?" Kalen stared at her in disbelief. In Kalen's world, nobody helped someone without expecting something in return. Yet the girl standing before him was different. He accepted the bread with trembling hands, then nodded quietly. Sienna looked him over for a moment, then she pulled another piece of bread from her bag. "Here, eat." Kalen froze. No one had ever shared food with him before. No one had ever treated him like he mattered. It was only a small piece of bread. Yet years later, Kalen would still remember that moment, because that moment changed the course of his life forever. From that day on, Kalen began following Sienna, not because she asked him to, but because for the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone. And from that day forward, a debt of gratitude began taking root in his heart. A debt he would one day repay with nearly everything he had. After that day, Kalen was almost always seen beside Sienna. At first, it was nothing more than gratitude from a child who had been shown kindness. But as the years passed, that feeling grew into something much deeper. Sienna was unlike anyone Kalen had ever known. While most people ignored the children of the slums, she treated them like real people. She often brought leftover food from home to share with them. Sometimes she even helped patch up their injuries after fights. To young Kalen, Sienna was a light in an otherwise dark world, and like many people later would, he began to admire her. The years passed quickly. While Kalen struggled to learn reading and writing from local priests, Sienna devoted herself to sword training. Her talent revealed itself early. Even grown swordsmen were amazed by how quickly she improved. Whenever people praised Sienna, Kalen felt proud as if he himself had earned the compliment. Yet during those same years, the first warning signs quietly appeared. They were subtle, so subtle that nobody paid attention, especially not Kalen. One year, Sienna entered a youth sword tournament in the city. Before the final match, she sprained her wrist during training. It wasn't a serious injury, but it was enough to affect her performance. Seeing her worried, Kalen spent every coin he had saved to buy the best medicine he could afford. Money he had earned through months of odd jobs. Yet he never hesitated. Thanks to that medicine, Sienna recovered in time for the tournament, and she won the championship. That night, everyone celebrated her victory. No one knew what Kalen had sacrificed to make it happen. More importantly, neither did Sienna, not because she deliberately stole credit. She simply viewed Kaylin's help as something natural. And Kaylin thought so too. Years later, a similar incident happened again. By then, Sienna was being considered for admission into a prestigious sword academy. However, the academy required an enormous enrollment fee. Her family couldn't afford the full amount. While everyone worried about the situation, Kaylin quietly sold the most valuable thing he owned, a pendant left behind by his mother. He had never told anyone about it, not even Sienna. When the academy announced that the fee had been fully paid, Sienna was overjoyed. She hugged Kaylin and thanked him for always being there. That single moment made Kaylin happy for months. What he failed to notice was a dangerous habit forming between them. Whenever Sienna faced a problem, Kaylin was the one who sacrificed something. Whenever Kaylin suffered, he dealt with it alone. No one forced it. Yet it slowly became the norm. As the years passed, the balance between them quietly shifted. Kaylin still saw Sienna as the most important person in his life. Meanwhile, Sienna grew increasingly accustomed to receiving his support. One afternoon, when they were around 15, they sat atop a stone wall overlooking Valeris. Sienna stared at the distant towers and spoke about her dream. One day, I'll become the strongest swordswoman in the kingdom. Everyone will know my name, Kaylin smiled. You definitely will. Sienna turned toward him. What about you? Kaylin hesitated. Truthfully, he had never spent much time thinking about his own future. Most of his thoughts revolved around helping Sienna achieve hers. In the end, he simply smiled. I'll be behind you, supporting you, Sienna laughed. That sounds exactly like you. Neither of them knew how prophetic that statement would become. Kaylin truly would spend years standing behind her, supporting her, sacrificing for her, and eventually paying a terrible price for that choice. In the kingdom of Valeris, no day was more important than Awakening Day. It was the day every young person stood before the sacred stone to receive their class. Some became swordsmen, some became mages, others became blacksmiths, scholars, or merchants, and a fortunate few received rare classes capable of changing their destinies forever. That year, Kaylin and Sienna had both turned 16, together. They attended the Awakening ceremony in the capital's Grand Hall. Hundreds of young men and women gathered inside the enormous plaza. Every one of them waited anxiously to discover their future. Standing among the crowd, Kaylin felt sweat forming on his palms. Not because he feared for himself. He was worried about Sienna. He knew she had devoted nearly her entire childhood to swordsmanship. Receiving an ordinary class would be devastating for her. Yet those concerns disappeared almost instantly the moment Sienna placed her hand upon the sacred stone. The entire plaza lit up. A brilliant silver light erupted from beneath her feet. The crowd gasped in astonishment. Even the priest conducting the ceremony looked stunned. Then words appeared above the sacred stone. Sword Saint Candidate. The entire plaza erupted. A legendary class. One that had appeared only a handful of times throughout the kingdom's history. Everyone immediately understood they were witnessing the birth of a prodigy. Sienna stood within the radiance like a figure from legend. Cheers echoed throughout the plaza. Her name spread through the capital almost immediately. Kaylin applauded louder than anyone. He was genuinely happy for her. This was the dream she had chased her entire life. Eventually, it became his turn. Kaylin took a deep breath and stepped toward the sacred stone. He placed his hand upon its cold surface. Several seconds passed in silence. Then a soft golden glow emerged, no, nearly as dazzling as Sienna's. Not enough to shock the crowd, yet enough to catch the attention of the priests. Slowly, words appeared. Holy healer. Murmurs spread through the crowd because it too was a rare class. True holy healers could save hundreds of lives on a battlefield. They were sought after by every elite adventuring party. The priest quickly congratulated Kaylin. But the first thing Kaylin did was look for Sienna. When he saw her smiling at him, he felt relieved. We both made it, Sienna said. Kaylin nodded. At that moment, he still believed their future would remain unchanged. Two friends moving forward together. Reality had other plans. Within months of the awakening ceremony, their lives began changing dramatically. Prestigious academies sent invitations to Sienna. Nobles offered to sponsor her. Training sword guilds viewed her as the kingdom's future. Kaylin received something very different. Work. Lots of work. Hospitals, churches, refugee camps. Places that constantly needed healers. While Sienna was celebrated as a rising star, Kaylin spent most of his days healing the poor who couldn't afford treatment, and he never complained. Every life he saved reminded him why he had chosen this path. Yet during that period, The first real gap between them began to form. Sienna grew increasingly accustomed to praise. Kaylin grew increasingly accustomed to being overlooked. One stood in the spotlight, the other remained behind the scenes, healing wounds nobody noticed. And it was at that moment that fate quietly began preparing the tragedy to come. Because soon, Sienna would discover a forbidden power, a power capable of turning her into a legend, and Kaylin would become the one forced to pay its price. The years following the awakening ceremony were the fastest period of growth for both Sienna and Kaylin. Sienna's reputation spread throughout the kingdom. Meanwhile, Kaylin steadily became one of the most respected young holy healers in the capital. On the surface, everything seemed perfect, at least to those looking from the outside, because only Kaylin knew that something strange was happening to his body. At first, it was nothing more than mild pain appearing late at night, a dull ache deep inside his bones. Sometimes it was a pounding headache that lasted for hours. Kaylin assumed it was simply the result of overworking himself, so he paid little attention to it. But the symptoms gradually became worse. Some mornings he woke, feeling as though his entire body had been burned from the inside. On other days, his hands trembled so badly he could barely hold his healing tools. The strangest part was that every medical examination came back normal. No poison, no disease, no curse could be detected. As a holy healer, Kaylin understood the human body better than most. Yet for the first time in his life, he couldn't explain what was happening to himself. At the same time, Sienna's career continued to soar. One successful mission followed another. One heroic achievement after another. Her name appeared in the capital's newspapers. More and more frequently, the youngest sword prodigy in history, the rising star of Valeris, the future successor to the sword saint. Titles and accolades followed her wherever she went, and Kaylin was always happy to read them, at least at first, because over time, he began noticing another strange pattern. The worst episodes always occurred immediately after Sienna completed a major mission. At first, he dismissed it as coincidence, but the coincidence kept repeating. Every time Sienna returned from an especially dangerous battle, Kaylin endured a night of unbearable agony. One time, he even collapsed unconscious in his office. When he awoke, blood had run from his nose down to his collar. Strangely, the symptoms vanished completely a few days later, as though they had never existed. One autumn evening, Kaylin decided to ask Sienna directly. They were sitting in their usual cafe near the central plaza. "Something strange has been happening to me lately," Kaylin said. Sienna looked up from her tea. "What do you mean?" Kaylin explained the mysterious pain that had haunted him for months. He mentioned how every examination showed nothing wrong. Throughout the conversation, Sienna's expression remained perfectly calm, almost too calm. When he finished, she simply smiled. "You're probably just working too hard. Take a few days off and you'll be fine." It sounded reasonable. Yet for the first time, Kaylin felt something wasn't quite right. He just couldn't identify what it was. A few weeks later, a major event shook the kingdom. An elite expedition discovered the ruins of an ancient fortress hidden deep within the northern mountains. It was believed to contain secrets lost for centuries. Adventuring parties rushed to join the expedition. Sienna was no exception. Before leaving, she came to see Kaylin. "This mission might be dangerous. I'll be gone for about 2 weeks." Kaylin offered his usual encouraging smile. "You'll be fine. You always are." Sienna looked at him for a few moments. Then she nodded and left. Kaylin had no idea that expedition would change everything, because there, Sienna would come into contact with a forbidden power, a power no one should ever have touched. And from that moment onward, Kaylin's suffering would no longer be a mystery. They would become part of the design crafted by the person he trusted most. The northern expedition lasted far longer than expected. 1 week, then 2. Eventually, nearly a month. During that time, very little information returned to the capital. Only rumors grew increasingly alarming. Several adventuring parties vanished. Others returned with devastating casualties. People whispered that something deep within the ancient fortress should never have existed, a secret buried since a forgotten age. Meanwhile, Kaylin continued his daily work, healing the sick, saving lives, and waiting for news from Sienna. Yet the strange pains began occurring more frequently. This time, they didn't come only at night. Sometimes, while treating patients, a sudden spike of agony shot through his chest and nearly stole his breath away. There were days when he had to lean against a wall just to remain standing. Yet Kaylin told no one. He didn't want others to worry, especially Sienna. Then one morning, the entire capital exploded with excitement over a major announcement. The northern expedition had returned. and the name spoken most often was Sienna Ravenheart. When Kalen arrived at the Central Plaza to welcome the expedition home, he immediately sensed that something had changed. Sienna still looked like Sienna, the same dark hair, the same beautiful face he had known for years, but her eyes were different, deeper, colder, carrying something Kalen couldn't quite explain. When she saw him, she smiled as she always did, yet the smile never reached her eyes. "I'm back," Kalen sighed with relief. Everyone said that place was incredibly dangerous. Sienna chuckled softly. "It was. But I found what I was looking for." Kalen didn't understand what she meant, nor did Sienna elaborate. That evening, the kingdom held a celebration honoring the survivors. While everyone shared stories of heroism, Kalen noticed something strange. The other expedition members seemed reluctant to discuss the deepest section of the fortress. Whenever the conversation approached that subject, they quickly changed topics, as if there was something they desperately wanted to forget. 1 week after returning, Sienna's power suddenly skyrocketed. During a friendly tournament between elite adventurers, she defeated 3 renowned swordsmen in a matter of minutes. Even her former instructors were stunned. No one understood how her growth had become so absurdly fast, except one person, a man watching quietly from the stands. His name was Master Alric, a retired swordsman who had spent decades studying ancient combat arts. The moment he saw one of Sienna's techniques, his expression changed completely. After the match, he quietly approached Kalen. "You're close to her, aren't you?" Kalen nodded. The old swordsman remained silent for a moment before continuing. "Has she shown any unusual changes recently?" Kalen immediately thought of his mysterious pain, and the coldness he had noticed in her eyes after the expedition. Still, he shook his head. "I don't think so," Master Alric sighed. Then he pulled an old yellow document from his cloak. It was a copy of an ancient manuscript. The title immediately caught Kalen's attention: Forbidden Sword Arts. "These are techniques that were banned centuries ago," Alric said quietly, "because the price they demand is horrifying." Kalen glanced over the first section of the manuscript. Much of the text had faded with age, yet one passage remained legible. "The user shall obtain power beyond natural limits, but all backlash and damage shall be transferred to a suitable vessel." Kalen froze. "A vessel?" He looked up at Alric, but the old swordsman merely shook his head. "I have no proof. Perhaps I'm mistaken. But if that girl truly touched such power..." He never finished the sentence, because at that very moment, cheers erupted from the plaza for Sienna. She stood bathed in light and praise, like a perfect hero. Meanwhile, Kalen stood motionless, staring at the manuscript. For the first time in years, a terrifying thought entered his mind. What if his suffering wasn't random? What if it was connected to Sienna? And if that were true, would he have the courage to face the answer? For many years, Kalen had never doubted Sienna, no matter what others said, no matter how many rumors surrounded her. He was always the first person to defend her, but this time was different. Master Alric's warning kept echoing in his mind, along with the pain that was growing worse by the day. Kalen began doing something he had never done before. He started investigating Sienna. At first, he felt guilty, as if he were betraying his closest friend. But deep down, he knew he needed answers. Otherwise, these doubts would haunt him forever. Over the next few days, Kalen spent hours studying ancient records in the royal library. As a royal certified holy healer, he had access to records most citizens could never see. The more he read, the more uneasy he became. Many records regarding forbidden sword arts had been erased from history, yet a few copies had survived. In an ancient, nearly decayed book, Kalen found a passage that sent chills down his spine. The wielder of a forbidden sword art does not necessarily pay the full price. If a suitable life vessel is found, the backlash may be redirected. Kalen reread the passage several times. A life vessel. Someone else suffering in the user's place. A cold sensation ran down his spine, yet he still had no proof. Only suspicions. Then, an opportunity appeared. A few days later, Sienna arranged a private meeting with the core members of her party. The meeting was held in a private room above one of the capital's most famous taverns. Kalen wasn't invited. That was unusual. He was normally included in every important strategy session. When he asked why, one party member claimed the meeting was only for frontline combatants. Kalen didn't argue, but his unease continued to grow. That evening, he went to the tavern, not intending to spy. At least that's what he told himself. Yet as he reached the second floor, he heard Sienna's familiar voice through the door. Kalen stopped instinctively. The door wasn't fully closed. The conversation inside was surprisingly clear. The last activation was stronger than expected. It was Sienna, a man replied. Yet you suffered no backlash whatsoever. Correct, Sienna answered calmly.
Correct.
Everything was redirected. Kalen felt his heart pounding. The man continued. And the vessel? Is it still functioning? Silence lingered for several seconds. Then Sienna gave a soft laugh. Better than necessary. Kalen is stronger than I expected. In that moment, Kalen felt the world stop turning. He stood frozen in the hallway, unable to believe what he had just heard. Inside the room, the conversation continued. He still hasn't figured it out, the man asked. Sienna chuckled softly. Kalen has always trusted me. That's his greatest strength. Then she paused. And his greatest weakness. Kalen felt as if something had pierced straight through his chest. Not physical pain. For the first time in his life, he heard Sienna speak of him as a tool. Not a friend. Not a teammate. Simply something useful. Kalen took a step backward, then another. He didn't want to hear any more. But then Sienna spoke one final time. As long as he's alive, I will continue to grow stronger. Kalen left the tavern and disappeared into the night. He barely remembered the walk back home. Memories from more than a decade flooded his mind. The loaf of bread from years ago, every time he had helped her, every sacrifice he had made for her, every dream they had once shared, and now it all felt like a cruel joke. But what Kalen didn't know was that the truth was far worse. What he had overheard tonight was only a small piece of the puzzle, and before long, he would learn that he wasn't Sienna's first victim. After overhearing the conversation in the tavern, Kalen barely slept. For hours, he sat alone in the darkness of his room. Again and again, he tried to convince himself that he had misunderstood what he heard, that there had to be another explanation, a reasonable excuse, misunderstanding. Because if there wasn't, then his entire life would become a lie. Yet the harder he tried to deny it, the clearer old memories became. Tiny details he had never paid attention to before. Moments that once seemed meaningless, now carried a completely different meaning. For the first time, Kalen began looking back on their years together. From a different perspective, he remembered the Goblin Fortress mission 3 years earlier. The mission that had propelled Sienna's name across the entire kingdom. At the time, an ancient fortress had been overrun by thousands of goblins. 3 elite adventuring parties were sent to eliminate the threat, but things quickly spiraled out of control. Beneath the fortress lurked an abnormally evolved goblin king. Dozens of adventurers became trapped inside. Many believed the entire operation would end in disaster. The newspapers the next day claimed that Sienna had led the counterattack and saved everyone. They called her the Blade of Hope. But the truth had been very different. During that battle, Sienna had been severely injured within minutes of confronting the Goblin King. A single strike had nearly severed her right arm. Blood poured endlessly from the wound. The entire party descended into chaos. It was Kalen who kept her alive. For nearly 2 hours, he cast healing spell after healing spell until his body was completely exhausted. While others fought, Kalen protected the wounded and sustained the lives of his entire team. By the end of the battle, he collapsed from mana exhaustion. Yet the next day, all the credit went to Sienna. Back then, Kalen had never considered it unfair. He had genuinely been happy to see her praised. Now, that memory left a bitter ache in his chest, and it wasn't the only time. A year later came the Shadow Wolves mission. A pack of magical wolves attacked several villages along the southern border. What seemed like a simple mission turned into a nightmare when a high-ranking alpha beast appeared. During the battle, 3 party members were poisoned. Other healers declared they could no longer be saved, but Kalen stayed awake for 3 straight days. He personally crafted antidotes, personally oversaw the treatments, and ultimately saved all 3 lives. When they recovered, the first person they thanked was Sienna, because they all believed she had saved them. Kalen had simply smiled and remained silent. He had never felt the need for recognition, but now he was beginning to realize a painful truth. It wasn't that people forgot his contributions. They had never known about them in the first place, and Sienna had never corrected them. In the eyes of the kingdom, she was the perfect hero, while Kalen was merely the healer standing behind her. Over the following days, Kalen dug deeper into the past. The more he investigated, the more difficult truths he uncovered. Many of Sienna's most famous achievements bore Kalen's fingerprints behind the scenes. Her miraculous recoveries, her impossible victories, the triumphs hailed as miracles, all of them coincided perfectly with the worst periods of suffering Kalen had endured. Then, during his investigation, Kaylin met a woman named Mira, a former member of Sienna's party from years ago. The moment she heard Sienna's name, Mira's expression darkened. She remained silent for a long time before speaking, so someone finally started asking questions. Kaylin felt his heart sink. Mira looked directly into his eyes. Used to think I was the only one. Those words left Kaylin speechless, because for the first time, he realized something terrifying. He might not be the first person Sienna had used, and perhaps he wouldn't be the last. Mira remained silent for a long time after saying those words. Her face carried the hesitation of someone who had buried a secret for far too many years. Kaylin didn't pressure her. He simply sat quietly across from her, waiting. Eventually, Mira sighed. I was part of Sienna's party about 5 years ago. Back then, she wasn't nearly as famous as she is now, but her ambition was exactly the same. Kaylin listened carefully. At first, I genuinely admired her. Sienna was talented, brave, decisive, and she always knew how to make people trust her. Mira gave a bitter smile, just like she did with you. Kaylin didn't argue, because he knew it was true. Mira continued. There was a mage in our party named Rowan. He was incredibly talented. Some even considered him more promising than Sienna at the time. Kaylin began to feel uneasy. What happened to him? Mira stared out the window. He died. Silence filled the room. In what was officially recorded as an accident, but I never believed it was an accident. Kaylin felt a chill crawl down his spine. Mira pulled an old necklace from her pocket. The pendant was cracked down the middle. This was the last thing Rowan left behind. Before he died, he told me something. Mira's voice grew heavy. If I ever disappear, stay away from Sienna. Kaylin clenched his fists. He was beginning to understand why Mira had left the party, but what shocked him even more was what she said next. Rowan wasn't the only one. Kaylin looked up. What do you mean? Mira took a deep breath. Over the years, strange things kept happening to people close to Sienna. Some disappeared. Some suffered crippling injuries and retired. Others suddenly weakened for no apparent reason. Kaylin felt his chest grow heavier, because it sounded disturbingly familiar. Far too familiar. Mira looked at him with pity. Kaylin, I think you're the next one. Those words struck him like a blade through the heart, because deep down, he had already known. He simply didn't want to admit it. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but before leaving, Mira handed him a small journal. I've kept this for years. It may help you. That night, Kaylin returned home and opened the journal. Inside were Rowan's personal notes. Dozens of pages filled with research on curses and ancient magic. Then, near the end, he saw a familiar phrase. Life vessel. Kaylin's heart pounded. Rowan had discovered something before his death. In his final notes, Rowan wrote that he believed Sienna had found a way to transfer magical backlash onto another person. However, he never found proof, because only days later, he died during a mission. Kaylin reread those lines over and over. The pieces were finally starting to fit together. The pain, Sienna's unnatural growth in power, the people who mysteriously disappeared from her life. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. But at that moment, bells rang throughout the capital, a special bell used only for major royal announcements. Kaylin stepped onto his balcony and looked. Down at the plaza, a royal herald was reading the king's latest decree, and the first name mentioned was Sienna Ravenheart. For her extraordinary service to the kingdom, Sienna Ravenheart shall be granted the title of royal champion. The crowd immediately erupted into cheers. Her reputation had reached a new peak. Meanwhile, Kaylin stood silently in the darkness, because he understood that the higher she climbed, the harder her eventual fall would be. And somewhere deep inside, he began making a decision that would change both their destinies forever.